Hello, my name's Tom Kyle. I'm making this video today to explain about a not so new but current phenomenon, which I'm going to name Nouveau Ponzi Scheme, which is endemic, I believe, probably in Northern Europe, but definitely in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the term Ponzi scheme. Carlito, or Charles Ponzi, was an Italian immigrant into America, and he found there's a deviation between the price of stamps which he used for selling things in and across borders between the Italian price and the American price. And what he did is he started to buy one type of stamp, then somehow selling it in the other place, making a profit. So he was making a profit between, not currencies, but it was an exchangeable item, so it was a similar kind of thing. It was basically using a certain type of stamps, sending packages between the two countries. What he then did is he told friends of his and people he knew that this was an area to be exploited. Now, he'd been in prison and stuff like that. He hadn't done very well for himself, but he was very ambitious, and eventually people started paying him to help him do this, so that he had more capital, so he could make more money on this differential. The point is that this continued, and eventually there were so many people paying him money that the entire world market of these stamps wasn't worth a fraction of what had been paid to him. So of course there was no way he could ever actually pay all the people their money back. But of course, because he had been paying some people back their money, and they were seeing all these prices go up and up and up, people very eager to continue to spend with him. And as Mark Twain is famously quoted as saying, it's a lot easier to fool a person than to convince them that they've been fooled. And so therefore the thing snowballed out of control. Obviously, all banking, when it comes down to it, is a Ponzi scheme and a fractional reserve system. It's all a con. If everybody took their money out, there would be no money to pay them all. So you've got to take it in the context of the world we live in. But on a more micro scale, Ponzi schemes are generally considered schemes where people pay money into something and there's not enough money to pay all the people back out, and then normally the money's been paid into schemes which they haven't necessarily wanted to invest in. Now, what is now the novelty which is now coming is, instead of paying out certain people high returns to attract other people, what the criminals do is they spend the money on something else, but they tell you that they're spending it on that for you, but they get bent solicitors to deliberately fuck up the paperwork. Well, it's not fucked up. They deliberately make sure that it looks like you're buying it, but you're not buying it for you. You're buying it on behalf of their company for a subsidiary, which they often wholly own anyway. So effectively what they'll do is they'll buy something off themselves, sell it back to themselves. So you pay for a transaction, pay a load of money, and they sell it back to themselves. They link this to, and it's, it might sound complicated, but it's not. So say, for instance, you've got, say, a property in Turkey that's being built. So you pay installments and you pay for the land, but they haven't transferred the title deeds across. But they is a company that owns a company that owns a company in Turkey. So you're paying the money to a solicitor who then releases the funds. But then when it turns out the title deeds haven't been passed into your name, they'll say, well, it's to pay the company because you're buying it as part of a collective, but you've never bought anything as part of a collective. You're not a shareholder. You're an actual, it's quite clear that you're buying something and you've got title of it, and the memorandum of sale will say this, but they'll say, oh no, it's a different company, but of course they own that company. And for instance, in the case of the Aston Lloyd Ponzi scheme, which is what woke me up to this, and the one that I put money into, I knew from day one that there's absolutely no way anything could go wrong without absolute outright criminal fraud. Nothing could really go wrong otherwise, because you were paying for instalments. If the instalment hadn't happened and it got certified as complete, then that's criminal fraud. It doesn't matter if it happened on the moon or anywhere. Now, this nonsense about cross-jurisdictional issues and it's what's on the ground in Turkey. If you sign the agreement with an English company in England on an English law contract and you give it to an English solicitors, it doesn't matter where the property is. And the fact they've got a wholly owned subsidiary in Turkey which is not doing what the parent company wants it to, when it's run by the same people or whoever, it's nonsense. Now, in the case of the Aston Lloyd Ponzi scheme, a gentleman by the name of Tolga Kaysner, or Kiesner. He's a Turk who owns lots of property around the Bodrum area in Turkey. He owned the land. He sold the land to the criminals in England. And then he had shares in the building company who allegedly, but we've never had sight of it, put a charge on the land for a certain amount of money, which then meant they had to be sold back to him. But the whole point is there's no evidence of this charge. It's never been substantiated. He's never even been asked to produce. They just ask us to pretend that we believe that there is one. And of course, why on earth, if you're building domestic dwellings, you're not building like a power plant or a big road, why would he be shelling out money on a domestic dwelling if he's not been paid the stage payments and accruing £1 million or circa £1 million debt on 50 domestic dwellings? It's totally inconceivable. If you've got a track record of not being paid your stage payments, you've got no obligation to continue to accrue a debt. It makes absolutely no sense. So to be clear, Tolga sold the land in the first place at a massively extortionate rate, which is fine. If they bought it, there's nothing illegal about that. But when you put it all together, obviously it becomes extremely suspicious. So then he sold it to these English criminals, which would be Colby Verk, I believe, but I don't know, because Colby Verk's been very clever to surround himself by a wall of like Essex wide boys, the likes of Michael Nascimento, Joe Upchurch, who was the managing director of the firm, James Rowlatt, all these people. Well, actually, Joe's not actually. He's from Kent. I think he's from Maidstone. But the point is, they're just scumbags from the southeast. They've got these mockney Cockney accents. They just come across like thieves, and he surrounded himself by them. So every single thing he does, he's got like a wall of protection, like a cathodic protection from all these white boys from the southeast of England who you wouldn't trust as far as you could throw them. But of course, nobody actually put money in, or I didn't. You wouldn't ever pay these people money, but it turns out because you bought through an agent, then you find out, well, the agent's got nothing to do with it, and the agent then closes down, and you find out that you're actually dealing with these scumbags from Essex and fucking Kent, and these people you wouldn't trust to walk your dog because they're so dishonest, and they don't have a clue. If you ask them a question about anything, they've got no clue about anything. It's total plausible deniability. Of course, no one would ever actually, who had any sense, would ever invest with them. But once you find you're lumbered with these people, and they really don't know what they're doing, they're ripping you off. But even if they're trying to do a diligent job, they can't even really deny what they're doing because they don't even know what they're meant to be doing. For instance, there's no records of any project management or anything happening. But there's a guy called Michael Lucas, who's marked down as project manager. Now, Michael Lucas's prior work history was he worked for British Airways. I believe he falsified some qualifications to get that job. Then there was some mortgage fraud that he was up to with Colby Verk, where there was some flats in Kingston, and in the same week as he bought this flat, a flat across the landing of this quite new development, got sold for like 50 grand less or something than what he paid for it. So they're shifting money around the background, not through wages. And the thing is, this guy was like the project manager. The guy's a complete idiot. He's an ugly little toe rag. The way it works is you surround yourself by all these firms. So, for instance, you'll get an accountancy firm to sign the books off as good, and you can say, well, they signed them off as good, so they must be good. They weren't good. They had triple, double, and triple accounting. So, for instance, they'd put a property down as an asset. They'd also say they've sold it to the person who's, the dupe who's put money into the scheme. So it's like double accounting. And then what they'll say is they'll announce a profit from selling it to them. So you've got like the same, it's like triple entry accounting for the same thing. So it's like going to a pub and the pub saying that all the beer that the people have just bought in the last half hour is still a company asset. It's not a company asset, it's already been sold. So, it's like they're counting it as being in the barrel down in the cellar, and it's been sold, but it's still theirs. And but it gets more complicated with land, because what they've been doing is they're doing it 3 times. I forget how they're doing it. They're basically counting it as when they bought it. That's an asset. They bought it. They took the money in. It's very confusing, because then they're saying it went to this subsidiary, but it's not really confusing when you look at it. It's all contained within one area. The figure that their accounts are worth at the end of it are worth more than what they've actually got in the company. And in the instance of Aston Lloyd, you've got a company called KPSB Partnership, and I'm outright accused them of this fraud, and all they've done is said it might be defamation. I'm like, well, surely you should be saying it is defamation. It's not defamation, it's true. And they're like, oh, you think you're clever. You think you're an accountant. No, I don't need to be an accountant. It's obvious. Triple accounting is illegal. Oh, you must be an expert. Well, yeah, quite clearly anyone can look at that and see that that's what it is. You don't need to be an expert witness. You don't need to spend thousands and thousands of pounds. One of the other victims of the fraud was actually a chartered accountant. He said you'd have to spend £250,000 on a forensic accountancy firm to confirm what you're saying is true. But of course, you wouldn't be allowed to see the records, so it would be impossible. So you've got this kind of like nonsense that starts coming out of people's mouths when they've been ripped off, because they don't want to admit that they've been ripped off, and then they start finding problems with the potential solutions, which are just ludicrous. But the reason they're saying this is because they're so under the cosh that they're kind of retarded. They're probably quite clever normally, but they're so under pressure and they can't deal with it that they start saying incredibly stupid things. And this is one thing that's a very, very big obstacle, because this sort of enforced retardation is used across the group, the body of all the people. And because they're trying to say that you're a shareholder and it was like, a risk, and in fact you actually bought something, and these people then start having like voting rights. So you've got some complete imbecile. That guy isn't a complete imbecile. He's just, I don't think he's particularly bright, but he's he's actually an educated guy. He's all right. He's just completely stressed out of his mind, so he starts saying stupid things. But you then start getting kind of like the naughty dog syndrome. So you get the most lowest sycophantic imbecile getting sort of voting rights, because what they've then combined it with is they put in place a insolvency procedure, completely bogus, based on a draft witness statement. So the only witness statement we got to see to support the application to take the insolvency on was a draft. So it wasn't an actual. We've never actually seen what they put in. And they then set up what's called a creditors committee. Again, it's meant to be voted on. Well, they said it was voted on. These people, there's no evidence of any votes. And it just so happened that all the imbeciles got on, the sycophantic imbeciles who knew nothing about anything. And as a result, 2 years went by, and after 2 years, when insolvency procedures take over, if they haven't attacked the directors in that time, they can't afterwards, and it gets handed over to the official receiver. Now, I knew they were running that at the time. It was obvious that's what they were doing. But all the imbeciles were going, give them some time, give them some time. Now, give them some time to do what? It shouldn't be an insolvency procedure. And then they were selling assets that weren't theirs to sell. So, for instance, they sold a house in Turkey. So to be clear, they were acting as the directors of a firm which I'd paid money for on a memorandum of sale that said upon completion of the funds transferred, title 100% will be Tom Carhill's, which is my name, right? So I paid them all the money. Then they took over the company, and then they said, "Oh right, no, you've got shares. We're going to sell it to give the money back to the other creditors." So it's all completely bent, and obviously I don't tend to let them get away with it, but it's quite shocking. Now, there is a slight upside to it, I suppose, which I don't really feel weakens my position. It's the fact that when you're dealing with criminals in Turkey, like Tolga Keizner, I've been told from various Turks that I've spoke to about this that he's very dangerous, and if you actually went and moved into that house, it's not a matter of him just conceding that really that's yours. All the other people in that development would then learn what had happened to you, and then all the other developments around there where you've been shafting people, they would all find out about it. So you can't actually move into that house now, even if you've got it. You just get killed, because that's just what they'll do, because there's no way he'll lose his entire, because he's a criminal. He does this kind of thing all the time, and basically they just take you out. So there's no way you can actually even realise your asset one way or the other. So effectively you need to get something out of that particular context. Now, I also think this is something that the criminals in England who are purely white collar criminals, I can assure you there's no violent, dangerous streak to them. They're relying on the fact that they've got proper criminal backup to an extent in that region, so that if anybody ever did actually win, if you like, in inverted commas, win in a court situation and the house was told that it was theirs, as soon as they moved in, the thing will get burnt down, or they get fucking their kneecaps blown off, and then everyone else will be too scared to do anything about it. So that's what I feel the situation is with this. So anyway, probably maybe had to put in a bit of background detail there that might have seemed a little bit unnecessary, but the reason is these things, they work like a spider. They're not that straightforward, which is why people find it hard to follow them. So, Nouveau Ponzi scheme. The key difference between this and a normal Ponzi scheme is you do not pay out huge dividends to people, like bogus dividends to people at the start to attract new clients. You make all the people think they're buying something that's theirs. You have paperwork, which in England quite clearly denotes that thing, whatever it is there. Now that could be land in another country, it could be properties, it could be like investment in wheat, or I mean, again, then it starts getting more frivolous stuff like carbon credits and stuff like that. But they also went in for that later on. Now, so they think they're actually getting it. They got these title certificates. It's not going to be worth anything because it is worth something in England, but the point is in that other country, they're just not transferring any of the title across. And then what they're going to say is it's a Turkish matter, or it's a Bulgarian matter, or it's a Cypriot matter, but it's not, because the whole point is nothing's being done in that country. So they're actually transferring it to some other people in that country who are part of their criminal clique. It's all like a complete huge con. So, and also what happens is once the peak of money gets taken in, the ringleaders leave the firm and go and set up another firm doing the same thing, and they leave like the next generation of the same criminals to sit in there and just pretend they don't know anything about anything, and that everything's just gone all wrong because of the credit crunch. Now, of course, if you're paying for a house to be built in a country when there's a credit crunch, there's no possible way that the house wouldn't get finished, because labour would be cheaper, materials probably might be cheaper, might not be. But the point is, it's not going to make any difference. If you've got a contract to build it, and also you'd also have the fact that they would have invoices denoting what had been paid for and how much things cost. Now, if there's no evidence of any of that stuff happening, why isn't there? The whole point is because they had no intention of giving it to you in the first place. There was no project management function. They just had some criminals in that country building it for themselves and saying it was yours when it wasn't. Now, this might all sound like incredibly complicated, but it's not really, because you've just got to remember that when people do criminal actions, if it's a fraud-based action, they do things to make it complicated. They don't do things to make it simple. And then this gives the police, who are always in on every big fraud, because you wouldn't possibly do a fraud 5 minutes walk from the head of fraud squad in the City of London if you didn't have police complicity. Only an idiot would actually try that. Of course, obviously, once in a while people do get sent to prison for fraud, but generally speaking, they either get a very small token sentence and only 1 out of like 50 conspirators goes down for like 1.5 years or something, or they're working class people who've like did all the dole, or they've stole something like £15,000 or something completely minor. It's never, no one who ever steals a lot goes to prison for a long time, and that's all by design. You know, it's all quite clearly set out. Now, once you understand this, when you go and speak to the police, you've got to remember that I've never gone to speak to the police I've always gone to speak to them in good faith, but I know they're deceiving me. So when I go to see them, I know they're going to lie, and I know they're going to try and cheat me. So because I know they're going to do this for a fact, I put things in place so that in the future, like 1 or 2 or 3 years later, they're going to realise, oh shit, we shouldn't have said that. Oh shit, I'm putting things in place to prove that they've acted wrongly from day one. I know they're going to do that. That's not bad faith. It's just, I know from past experience and what other people say what they're going to do. It's very clear. So you see, I know they're not going to act, and I know they're not going to do this. So I put the paper-based record in, force evidence on them, force crime reports on them, which I did. I haven't got the crime reference number on me now, but I wrote them right at the start. My friend told me, he said, you need to write them straight from the beginning, because as soon as you do that, so yeah, the reason that you put things in place so that you kind of trap them in the future into not being able to deny that they've had things that they have had, and you keep insisting on them looking at certain things, you knowing that they won't. Now, this is the same for the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the Legal Ombudsman, all of which will eventually contradict themselves, because what they do is they try and placate you to start off with. They lie lots, They always put this stuff in writing, and the whole point with this is you want to get two or more birds with one stone. Once these organisations know that you know what they're up to, and you know they're a criminal, just basically a front of respectability for crime, they eventually know not to mess with you, and then in the future, these ridiculous amount of hoops that you have to jump through, which are thoroughly depressing, are designed to run out statutory time limits and stuff like that, and basically just designed to depress you into like a state where you can't really function properly. You won't have to go through that. And one of the things I've found very useful is once you've got a body of knowledge about criminals who've actually obviously lied and behaved criminally at each of these organisations, if you just reel out their names and say what they've done, it gets them, it's like basically puts a rocket up them, and they do what they're told. And also, if you're nice to them following that, like one of the ones you haven't dealt with, they're very keen not to be tarred with the same brush, and they often are very much more compliant. I'll give you an example. The Ian Puddick case, where there was an operation launched against him called Operation Bohan. Ian Puddick, like Puddick. I mentioned officers who perjured themselves in court in his case, and when I mentioned them in some email or something, the police's attitude was like, "Oh, you mustn't mention them. You mustn't mention." They just turn into they're just like little whinging little children. It's because they know they just hate being called out for what they are, which is, basically they're just corrupt as fuck. And I mean it's just obvious. And the thing is that with all of these organisations, you have to explain to the idiots who just they just take everything on face value, that you're paying tax for people to rip you off. And some of these companies are pseudo-government organisations, but still the government will refer you to them. So the Law Society is not part of the government, but you have to deal with the Law Society. I'm not saying the Law Society is all bad, but obviously it's corrupt. It's like a trade union for lawyers. Most lawyers are bent, therefore it's a criminal organisation. Most of its activities are criminal. The legal ombudsman, again, they start trying to persuade you that if you made a complaint to them, you're not allowed to take the person to court, and you're not allowed to know, you're not allowed to sort of share. It's all this nonsense, like they're not allowed to explain to you why they've come to their conclusion or who came up with the conclusion. It's all the opposite of democracy. It's all kind of like totalitarian, like what do you call it? It's a bit like fascism and communism. You just sort of put your suggestion in a box, and then maybe they'll come around and shoot you, or maybe they'll let you go and see Stalin and give you a job for a bit and shoot you later when you disappointed him. This is the kind of approach that they take, and this is what they're trying to bring in the country. They already pretty much have brought it in, but most people are so stupid that if you tell them that that's what's going on, they just, at every single point, will fight tooth and nail say that isn't the case.